Welcome to our program on developing issues in NFT law. We will address legal and regulatory issues facing creators and attorneys in this rapidly expanding area of law and technology. This program is presented by the American Bar Association's International Law Section, International Art and Cultural Heritage Law Committee, the Intellectual Property Section's Copyright and Emerging Technology Committee, the Business Law Section's Intellectual Property Committee, and the Forum on the Entertainment and Sports Industries Art and Museums Division. Our panelists today are professionals at the forefront of art and technology. Let me introduce you to them. Donna Riddell is a professor of blockchain and digital assets at Fordham University Law School and a New York Angels board member. Nicholas D. is the managing editor for global policy and regulation at CoinDesk. Sarah Conley Odenkirk is a partner at Cohen, DeBetts, Abrams and Shepard LLP, and Sam Miller is a corporate finance partner at Rimon Law and founder of the Fine Art Ledger. This is the first of two programs involving legal issues and the blockchain. On May 12th at 11 a.m. Eastern, the International Art and Cultural Heritage Law Committee will present a program titled Art at the Laundromat, discussing concerns about cryptocurrency and money laundering in the art trade. And now to start. Donna Riddell, will you take it, please?
Sure, thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here. So my task is in a very short period of time to kind of distill down what's happening in the NFT space, which is experiencing a boom since, let's just say, the last year. Now, is it coincidental it happened during COVID? Was the infrastructure getting in place beforehand? I guess it's a little bit of a chicken and egg. But at the same time, we're seeing a number of different things happening, which the panel will touch on. And as Susan rightly said, there's just so much going on that we won't be able to do everything. She'll have to spill over into at least another 2 or 3 panels in the future. So with the infrastructure for NFTs, and should I go back and say NFTs is short for non-fungible tokens. We're going to assume a certain amount of knowledge, but Susan or Sam or Nick or Sarah will jump in if they think that the audience doesn't understand some of the nomenclature. So NFTs have been around for quite some time, but the infrastructure was being built over the last number of years. And we've seen an explosion, not only in the interest from many retail customers, from art, from musicians, from every sector of the art and cultural world, as well as we're seeing from sports fans. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the sports fans marketplaces that exist. This infrastructure that is being built includes the ability for the artists, and I'll use the term broadly, the artists to mint, to create their own non-fungible token. Those tokens are then sold on marketplaces. That's a big body of law we'll have to cover and uncover in the next hour or so. And we need to look at also, or you need to look at whether you're an artist, you're a buyer, or you're a lawyer in the space. What are the terms and conditions relating to all of those marketplaces? That's a big area of concern. Underpinning all of the NFTs is a blockchain. For the most part, that blockchain is the Ethereum blockchain, though there are lots of other blockchains that are being used, in particular in the sporting arena. With Top Shot, you have the Flow blockchain. Top Shot is a really good example of what I call a more walled garden approach. You have there a number of different issues that you can see were grappled with. One is intellectual property. Top Shot is a joint venture between the NBA and Dapper Labs. Dapper Labs is located in Canada, so sure, they considered Canadian law, but a lot of the clients are from the United States. So clearly they had to think about the US law. And I'll just name a couple of the areas just to start. of law that we need to consider. So it's not and you're not an NBA lawyer, you're a lawyer that now, or a business person that needs to consider these following types of law. And this is not an all-inclusive list. I'm sure we'll touch on a few others. IP is first and foremost a really big area to think about. Who owns the intellectual property? What can you do with it? Et cetera, is every single bit of concern here. Going along with IP, of course, are all the other areas of concern: copyright, what can you do, who has the copyright? And we've seen a number of issues already arise. We saw DC Comics send out a letter to a lot of the people that do a Wonder Woman and said, no, 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 you can't do that. That we own the IP of Wonder Woman. So all those NFTs need to be taken down. What does it mean to take an NFT down on the blockchain? I thought blockchains were immutable. How do we get it down? That's another question to think about as we go forward here. There's also, between the US and other jurisdictions, there's the jurisdictional issue. Along with the jurisdictional issue, I'm sure we'll touch on something called moral rights. It's not as big in the US as it is in Europe. That's an area of specialty, I'm sure, for Sam. Then we have contract law. We all know about contract law, but how many contracts are involved in one NFT? What is a smart contract that these things are being done on? We'll have to unbundle that. And are smart contracts even smart? So that needs to be done. Where's liability? Is it with the marketplaces? Is it with the creator? These issues are just being discovered and unbundled. So it just says when one has to be careful whether you are a creator, a marketplace, a lawyer, a business person, or if you're somebody who along the way bought an NFT and then is reselling it. And that's a big issue here because things are being resold very quickly, not as in the traditional artwork where you might hold something for a while. Sometimes you don't even hold it for a day. Then we get into issues of KYC, AML, BSA, all of the anti-money laundering rules and regulations. Lots of question marks about who's responsible. In the end of the day, does it fall upon the creator in some of these issues? Property rights, sound familiar? You did that in first year of law school. Taxes, well, who's collecting taxes? Is it the responsibility of the marketplace? What about sales tax? What about creating at the end of the year your tax forms? Then we'll have all other kinds of issues that will come up, I'm sure, in the panel relating to securities law, securitization of assets, fractionalization of artworks. And we'll touch on a number of cases that have already started to develop, whether they be actual cases that are being adjudicated or just not hypotheticals, but real situations that the industry is starting to struggle through. There are many, many challenges, but there are huge opportunities. And when something is new and the entire space is a startup, and every one of the entities within it are a startup, there's a lot that can go wrong, but there's a lot that can go right. And so we are very hopeful, but we're very cautious in going through. And I hope, Susan, that it starts the landscape of all the things we need to plow through in getting at least some general understanding and having a really fantastic conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Donna. Now, Nick D. will introduce the issues legislators are looking into, including securities fraud.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. So as Susan said, my name is Nick. I'm a reporter and editor at CoinDesk, and I've been covering the legislature and its views on crypto for a couple of years now. And at the federal level, there really isn't a whole lot going on. You have a handful of bills and laws that sort of dance around this idea of, where does crypto fit in? NFTs are, frankly, just not even on anyone's radar as far as I know at this point. But yeah, it's an ongoing concern, it's an ongoing question. Right now, the big question is really, who actually has jurisdiction over crypto? That's something that Congress has not really tried to address in any meaningful way beyond, a single bill in 2020. There is some effort now there's a bill passed by the entire House, actually. It's actually sitting before the Senate, but a bill sponsored by Representative Pat McHenry, which kind of sort of looks to address this. It would create a study and within a year, hopefully create some recommendations on who has jurisdiction. At the state level, though, things are a lot more clear. Obviously, states have jurisdiction over any money transmitter, which basically amounts to every crypto exchange operating in the U.S. So, a lot of the crypto operations are really just governed at the state level right now through the money or finance regulators operating in each of the 50 states. 49 states. Montana doesn't have a money transmission license. It's a interesting and my favorite little factoid. But yeah, it's really kind of just everything is very immature at this point, I think is a fair way to put it. Um, and again, even at the state level, even though it is most states are pretty, at the very least are looking at this, there's still nothing, around specifically NFTs or decentralized finance, which has also taken off a lot in the past year. So a lot of these concerns and a lot of how crypto startups have to look at regulations really come through the lens of existing finance and technology rules. So, Donna mentioned the concerns around money laundering. There are some suggestions that NFTs could be used to launder funds by rogue actors. And I'm not sure if anyone's really had the chance to do some research into whether that's happening yet, but it's been raised as a key concern in some regulatory reports. And where that kind of comes in is, again, we're going back to just existing money laundering rules and suggestions or proposed guidance by entities like the Financial Action Task Force, which is an international money laundering watchdog of sorts, that has produced a proposed guidance for different countries to follow, saying we should do more KYC and AML efforts on decentralized finance entities, on crypto exchanges, on anyone who transfers crypto from point A to point B. And within the US, that really kind of translates to FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. But again, a lot of it is just kind of it's fairly immature. It's mostly guidance. Securities law is where things get a little bit more clear. The SEC has been extremely active over the past couple of years, trying to basically bring the hammer down on anything it sees as an illicit securities transaction. So, usually that means if a company decides it wants to create a new crypto network to launch, an operation to solve some problem, and that company decides the best way to fund itself is to raise tokens or to sell tokens and use those proceeds. 99% of the time, the SEC has said that looks like an illegal securities offering. We're going to come after you with enforcement action. Uh, while that has helped kind of clarify, what entities shouldn't do, it's been a little less proactive in creating guidance that tells companies what they should do. The SEC Commissioner Hester Peirce has tried taking this on by publishing a proposed safe harbor that would let companies raise funds and operate for a couple of years and try to build out their network before they have to worry about securities registration. But for the most part, companies just kind of have to, either wing it or apply for a regulation crowdfunding or regulation A offering and make sure that they're completely in compliance there. The new SEC chairman, Gary Gensler, who took office about 3 weeks ago, has some ideas on how to improve this situation. He told Congress just yesterday, actually, that Congress should maybe consider creating a federal regime for crypto exchanges that would help improve investor protection rules. It remains to be seen whether Congress will act on this, but that's kind of how Gensler, who, by the way, has a lot of knowledge in crypto, that's how he's approaching this. So his words have weight. I think we might actually see some action, maybe in the coming months, based on that. But at this point, it's everything is just very early.
Thank you, Nick. Sounds like we have a lot to discuss this morning. Sarah Odenkirk is an art law lawyer. And Sarah, would you like to discuss the issues that your clients, artists, collectors, and other art world professionals are facing right now when it comes to NFTs?
Sure. Yeah, and I'll be referring back to a lot of what Donna brought up in her introduction, because that's certainly what I'm seeing in my practice as well. And I'm also hoping, I don't know if you mentioned this at the beginning, Susan, that participants in the webinar can put their questions into the chat or the Q&A. So hopefully we can make this a conversation as well. And not just each of us listing various areas of interest that could each in themselves be, you know, an hour conversation at least. So I think I'm not alone in the world of practicing attorneys to say that the last 2 months have been almost completely eaten up with people calling night and day about NFT questions. How do they get in? How do they deal with it? How do they, you know, get their lottery ticket in this brave new world? And it has raised a lot of questions, you know, because even for those of us who've been involved and paying attention to blockchain as it evolved and as it relates to the art world for the last couple of years, 3-4 years, I mean, it's not that old of an area. It's a little bit overwhelming at this point. So all of a sudden, with the sale of the Beeple work a couple of months ago, we saw people really paying attention to the potential for money making. And while that certainly does exist, I think that it's important for clients and attorneys to understand kind of the dichotomy in the marketplace in terms of where the money is coming from. A lot of the purchasing is still happening through the crypto streams of commerce, as opposed to, say, your traditional art collectors. That, I think, has the potential to change. And I think that there's a tremendous opportunity here for artists to be able to monetize work that previously has not been able to be monetized because of the fact that it's, say, conceptual art. So there are these great opportunities. However, there are also some tremendous challenges in terms of trying to figure out what are the terms that apply to these sales? What are the terms that apply to these NFTs? What does it mean when an artist takes their work and puts it on the blockchain? What does it mean when they create an NFT that they sell? And of course, you know, one of the things that we hear a lot in terms of the potential benefits of NFTs is, oh, it proves authenticity, it shows provenance. And the fact of the matter is that it doesn't really do those things at this point. You know, the authenticity is, yes, that there is somebody who made the NFT and that person minted the NFT, but whether or not that person has the underlying rights to do that is a whole other set of questions. And certainly that's a lot of what I'm seeing with my clients is a great excitement around either minting work or collaborating with other people. And all of a sudden, you know, if you start to layer in music, you've got all kinds of music rights that have to be paid attention to. And that becomes, you know, an additional layer of complication. So the authenticity piece has a lot of work to be done. Provenance is, you know, sort of only partly true in terms of being able to track who has purchased a work. Yes, you can see on the blockchain ledger which wallets the NFT has been in, but those are pseudonymous numbers that don't tell you exactly who has owned the work, and certainly there's no exhibition history that comes along with it. So in terms of comparing that to a traditional provenance analysis, there's some work to be done. What I'm seeing a lot of as well is very aggressive business techniques from businesses that have popped up overnight. Their sole purpose, it seems, is to help people navigate marketplaces like OpenSea. And, you know, it's true that when clients actually go to mint their work, it's not as easy as it initially sounded like it was going to be. And there are some complications, and it's unclear exactly what terms apply on these various marketplace platforms. And I think Donna mentioned as well that most of the transactions up until now have been taking place in Ethereum, which is a proof of work blockchain that has a lot of concerns around it with regard to the environmental impact. And I'm hearing a lot of pushback, especially in the art community, but in other communities as well, that are concerned about the environmental impact of what all this minting is placing on our world. So I have been encouraging people to take a minute take a breath and just see what comes, because there are some proof of stake chains that are strengthening their abilities to not only mint NFTs, but provide very user-friendly marketplaces. So I think that we will see some other opportunities coming up in the coming weeks and months that will give consumers a more eco-friendly opportunity to participate in the marketplace. And I see these things becoming very important considerations for clients as we move forward. And really, you know, again, I think I mentioned this before, I've spent more time being a wet blanket in the last couple of months than I really like to in my practice. I like to be able to tell clients, absolutely, we'll figure out a way to get that done. But the fact is that in the case of the NFTs, there's a lot still to be worked out. I think that there is something that will come of all of this, but it's a very quickly evolving area. And there will be some better options that are easier to access, easier to work with, and easier to comprehend and customize to what the needs are as we move forward. So with that, I'm gonna stop blabbing, because I could continue on for a lot longer and let Sam have a few words in here, and then hopefully we'll get some questions from the audience.
Thank you, Sarah. And now to Sam.
Thanks very much, Susan. Real privilege to be on the panel, and to Sarah and to Nick and to Donna as well. A lot of very interesting topics, and the technology that underlies everything and the legal technicalities that could come into all of it are very complex at early stage. And we all sort of run the risk, particularly on the legal side, of going into extrapolations, etc., which tend to perhaps confuse the issue, particularly because this is very early stage, and the technology itself is very complex. But really, as being sort of one of the people who is involved on the legal side in an advisory capacity on NFTs and blockchain as a whole, but at the same time involved on the practical side in the sense of being the founder of the Fine Art Ledger, which is a blockchain title and authentication platform. I think it's really important to actually understand the essence of what we're talking about from a practical point of view when we deal with NFTs and what they actually are and how they're represented in legal terms. So if we can create that crossover in a very sort of simplistic way, I think we've achieved a lot, because there's a lot of room for confusion and falling within the gaps as well. So really, what are we fundamentally dealing with? We're dealing with a digital asset, but that really doesn't answer sort of many of the questions as to what, specifically it really is. And we have to really look at what, to answer that question of what the blockchain ultimately is. And the blockchain really is just a, permanent, or what they call immutable collection of records which are tied together cryptographically in blocks. And what has been done with the technology, particularly through smart contracts, is the ability to create actual transaction outputs, which make those records that are on the blockchain controllable. And that is exactly what a digital asset is. And we use smart contracts to actually produce that result. But ultimately, what we're dealing with is simply a record held in digital form, which is held on a distributed ledger, which means that it's a simple ledger as we know it, except it's not controlled by one individual person, but it's controlled by potentially many thousands of individual nodes or super nodes that effectively validate those transactions or those records as being correct. So when we look at that, and we come down to the fundamental reasoning that we're simply dealing with a record, we have to understand what rights and obligations attached to that record. And like in just general, the real world, which this should really replicate, there should be no mystery about it, we have a situation where we have to define those rights and obligations which apply to those records. If I sell a car to you, the car isn't delivered by me giving you a copy of that record, in other words, a copy of the contract. How delivery is handled in that contract is defined by the very terms of that contract. And the same works for digital records that are on the blockchain. So when we look at what these digital records are, we can define them or divide them into two fundamental categories. And the first category is a record that stores its own value, for example, Bitcoin or Ether, or one of the many other virtual currencies or digital tokens, if you want to call them that, that exist on a multitude of other platforms, blockchain platforms. And the only reason why those tokens fundamentally hold intrinsic value is because we've all come together through this blockchain and cryptocurrency rush, gold rush, effectively it is at the end of the day, to recognize value in that individual token or that individual digital asset. But when we deal with NFTs, the discussion is a little bit different because we're dealing with a token, yes, a digital asset, but the primary underlying value is not the digital asset itself, but what is attached to it. And many don't realize the contractual or at least the technical nexus between the actual token and the underlying digital artwork that's attached to it. And that's where a lot of the complexity comes in, because that digital artwork is not stored on the blockchain. It's connected through that token through metadata. So it becomes effectively, what are the rights and obligations that attach to that digital record, being that token as associated with that digital artwork? And that's where things seems to have fallen through a gap, because people are buying these NFTs for a huge amount of money without understanding what rights and obligations they have with regard to the fundamental asset that it is supposed to represent. And people just assume that it's a digital token, the image itself is a digital token. So these are some of the questions which come to the fore, and you know, IP questions, etc., what rights are conveyed with these NFTs, etc., are a big issue, as Sarah Donna pointed out. We saw recently the Basquiat, I think it was a work on paper of Basquiat, where effectively some individual went and, or group tried to NFT it and sell it, and even offered to convey the IP with it. Now, the Basquiat estate obviously got upset about this because they had never licensed that IP to that group that minted the NFT. And to add insult to injury, this particular group went on and decided that they were going to, at the discretion of the buyer of the NFT, actually offer to burn the original work. In other words, take a match to it in favor of distilling that work within a digital image as an NFT, which is complete anathema to anyone who has any interest in art and artists and what art should be about, and fundamentally appreciating that rarely the real value is in real world assets. So I don't want to sort of go on about this, but I think it's a real fundamental issue to understand, is that these are just simple records. And the UCC Drafting Commission or committee, in looking at the UCC rules and how we define what they call controllable electronic records, has gone into this and will probably publish a new Article 12 to the UCC in dealing with how we transfer and deal with associated rights with controllable electronic records. Anyway, there's so much that I can go on about this, etc. But really, one of the things of the fine art ledger that we focus on is how we actually connect those physical assets to NFTs and really look at NFTs in a different way to really sort of promote their ultimate and best use cases, rather than just representing them as, you know, somehow magically digitally associated with tokens, and therefore, by virtue of that reason only, should be worthy of extreme value and this kind of gold rush which is happening at the moment. So I wanted to just stop there for the moment. There's so much that I could say on the regulatory side, as to how, where, and to follow on what Nick was saying with regard to, particularly the SEC oversight of this. And I agree completely. There has, for all intents and purposes, as far as the public is concerned, been, quiet on this. There was extreme enforcement on the security token side, and then on the utility token side with 2 no action letters in token jets and a pocket full of quarters, etc., where they're very limited. They extremely limited the usability of utility tokens. And now this sort of silence on the side of NFTs, which are essentially tokens issued by what could be said to be common enterprises, these platforms that mint them, where other people rarely are buying them with the expectation of profit out of the efforts of these market makers. Isn't there an argument there that this is really something which is an investment contract under a Howey test kind of analysis? So anyway, there's a lot of discussion, but I wanted to sort of leave this kind of for the floor and for questions to come through. And between us, we hope that we can address that in a very sort of erudite way. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Sam. So we do have questions. What are the remedies for artists for IP infringement aside from damages? And what happens to the infringing NFT? Going back to the IP.
I'll start, which is not the remedy, because I think we need to also start with who's responsible where. So the artist comes and sells or mints an NFT on a platform. There have been some problems in platforms where there was a IP infringement. Now, maybe the artist's IP infringement, or maybe in the instance that we talked about for DC Comics, and the platforms are becoming a little bit more proactive on this. But I would say for the most part, there's not a consistency across platforms on IP checking, copyright checking, et cetera. And so it's a little bit of a wild, wild west there until there's going to be more litigation or the ability for somebody to create some standards across all of the platforms, and maybe a vetting that goes from across them. And remember, it's not mandatory that if you mint on one platform that you sell on another platform, but we're not exactly sure in each one of those where the rights and obligations follow on the smart contracts, including the residuals that the artist gets. And I'll just leave the IP, the specific IP questions to the resident experts.
Well, I will say that this is one of the issues, of course, is what are the remedies? Because if you've got something on the blockchain, you can't take it off. So that's definitely a challenge. I think there's a question as to whether the DMCA even applies to the NFT marketplaces. So, at this point, we're gonna have to wait and see in litigation how things are handled. But certainly, this is one of the challenges, because when people are talking about smart contracts, there's this assumption that there are terms and conditions and remedies and methods for enforcement, and there's nothing like that there. Smart contract, I sound like a broken record, but it's just not an appropriate term here. It is a complicated code that can affect certain transactions. But it's certainly not a contract. And as Donna mentioned, the platforms are starting to pay attention, but I think in most cases there's a disclaimer of liabilities that's going on, as opposed to anybody taking responsibility, which makes sense. I mean, it would be very difficult for any of these platforms to actually vet and approve things as being legitimately, legitimate for minting and verify in some way that the minter has the rights to that. So it will be interesting to see what standards are implemented. I think that there could be some additional onus put on the minter to represent and warrant that they are in fact the owner of that work. And so perhaps there would be some way then of having, having some recourse. But again, you can burn NFTs, but you're still going to have stuff on the blockchain. It's still there. And so then the question is it about the image itself that's stored? Is it about who owns it and the link that's linking the NFT to that image? Is there some way to get, take the resale royalties, if there are any, and use those, or account for the profits? So there are lots of different things that can be looked at, but I think that is going to definitely be the subject of some litigation in coming months.
I think also, if I may add just a quick note too, that, just because a platform blocks access to the NFT, if you're, able to look through the block explorer and find the actual work on the blockchain, whether that's on Ethereum, where I think most of them live right now, or another, blockchain network, you might still be able to access the NFT, depending on if they set it up that way. So yeah, there's a lot of, I think, novel ground being trod here.
An audience member asked, is an NFT a derivative work?
That's a very interesting question. I guess, it depends would be the good lawyerly answer, but I think that you do need to look at the underlying work and what that underlying work is. But an NFT is certainly not the work itself, as Sam very well explained. So the NFT is this, I'm going to say the word smart contract, even though I don't mean it, smart contract that points to the work. But certainly I think people need to understand that when you look at the artwork part of what we're talking about, it really shouldn't be handled any differently than it would be in the physical world. The digital world is the same. So, if you create a copy or make something else, you are doing this, it's the same thing as if you reprinted something in real life or repainted something. So the rights don't change. The underlying copyright principles are not any different. It's a different media.
I really have to second Sarah on that. I mean, we think now suddenly, because we're dealing with technology, that this is some kind of magic which has come up there and now sort of attracts huge values and different principles, etc. It simply doesn't. I mean, there are fundamental principles out there. Yes, it's all early stage, etc. Yes, there is some confusion. Yes, it hasn't gone through the courts. Yes, etc., etc. But if you have Basquiat's work, which was called, I think, Comb with Pagoda or something like that, and someone just simply taking an image of it, that's clear copyright infringement without the right to do that. And I think we have to just really sort of come down to ground zero effectively and start applying really sort of fundamental principles. As Sarah mentions, a smart contract is just, executable computer code at the end of the day. It may contain aspects of, a traditional contract, etc., or elements of it. And the classic example that they use for a smart contract in the real world is a vending machine. You put the money in. If the money basically is above a certain amount, you get your soda out of the vending machine. If you've paid more than X amount, then the machine knows to pay you some change. And that's effectively what a smart contract is in rudimentary form. But the smart contract really just propagates and populates what a particular token is and what its functionality is. Remember, it's an electronic record. That's all it is. It doesn't tell you what the rights and obligations are with regard to that token or that asset. It doesn't tell you anything beyond the fact that it just populates a token and produces certain outputs based on certain circumstances, whether internal to the technology or external in what we call as external oracles. So I think the real answer is to come down to basic principles and really to assess this in a real world kind of way.
Yeah, and going on the real world, I do want to put some positive spin on the opportunities, and the business models. I do think for, let's just take artists, whether they be musicians or visual artists, the ability for them to receive money more rapidly than in the current situation, as well as to get residuals for the visual artist, is really very appealing. Now that comes with risks, and some of the risks are, if the artist is getting residuals on an ongoing basis, is there any vetting? Who does the money come from? Is it in some way perhaps a bad actor? Is there a responsibility for the artist to do some KYC on the money that's incoming? Will they get a knock on the door in 5 years from the DOJ and say they got money from some bad actor in Iran? So I think there needs to be a good sense of realistic conversation with the artist that would be your client. But there is a huge amount of opportunity for attaching value between the artist and the fan, the collector. We see that in the Top Shot between the NBA and the fan. That's a moment that's sold as an NFT, and there's been a huge market, and still is, in actual trading cards, in virtual trading cards, and this enhances the fan experience. And for the players, of course, it is money that comes into the NBA, and however that's a portion per player is I'm sure defined by their own internal contracts. But I think that artists are talking also about musicians, about embedding some kind of a ticket in the token. And so if you were to buy some of their NFTs, all of a sudden you get a surprise, which is a ticket to a concert that they're doing in a year. Kevin Abash, who's a visual artist, people that bought his recent series found out 3 weeks later that, boom, they have a new NFT there as a present for having bought the NFTs in the past. Now that's a perfectly legitimate thing to do. Yet on the other side, I heard about what would be a different kind of exploding NFT, that you buy the NFT and all of a sudden you're part of a fundraising for other NFTs, which crosses maybe into that you're in a security where people were raising money for a project together to produce more projects, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that there's lots of opportunity. There are really positive things that can be crafted here. But as in anything new, sometimes people are testing the boundaries before we know where the boundaries are.
And I agree fundamentally. I mean, I'm not saying that there's no huge benefits in blockchain NFTs and ownership in this way, etc. I mean, I'm a big blockchain evangelist and very involved from a practical point of view from this perspective of the fine art ledger. And the technology creates incredible opportunities for dealing with things in ways which make our day-to-day, or at least the day-to-day ways in which we currently do them, much more efficient. And one of them, for example, as Donna touched upon, is resale rights for artists, and tracking royalties, etc., through successive transfers of tokens which represent the underlying assets, etc. So don't get me wrong on that point of view. I mean, there is fantastic opportunity in the technology, but I think what I was saying is we have to come down to sort of ground zero to assess sort of the legalities of it in a way in which we apply existing principles to the extent that we practically can at this stage.
Rachel Muldoon asked, do you consider that the ERC 721 Ethereum smart contract is inadequate regarding artist resale royalties, IP, etc.?
Yes, I mean, the basic contract, the ERC 721 doesn't do much except set out some basic standards for the code, and it allows for the resale royalties to be written into that contract. So if you're using a standard contract that's an off-the-shelf contract, right now on some of these platforms, you can indicate how many percentage points of royalties you want for that resale royalty. You can't, for instance, designate more than one person to receive those royalties. So there's still some restriction in terms of what it can accomplish. And we're also talking about something that's just Ethereum based in terms of a standard at this point. So we have other platforms that are coming to the forefront that are proof of stake platforms that are going to have other smart contracts that they've embedded. Or of course you can spend a lot more money and have a developer put together your own custom smart contract. So I do think that there's a lot of room for improvement on those contracts, but they're not really contracts. They're, again, we're saying the same thing over and over again. It's just code that affects certain transactions. So I think looking at those standards as a way to develop the underlying code, that's great. It's not a substitute for having contracts that really lay out the rights and obligations with regard to those assets. So a lot of what I think we're seeing right now is an amalgamation of all the different things that NFTs are being used for, and people are experimenting with how to create a buzz around a certain asset. And what we will see over time is some re-siloing, I think, of interests. So you've got, a very useful use for NFTs in marketing campaigns, in building fan bases, in creating an interactive environment for consumers and marketers. That's going to be a little bit different, I think, from the fine art market. And so we are going to see some differentiation in terms of the standards and abilities for smart contracts and real contracts to be establishing new methods and means for artists to participate in this digital economy.
What are the terms of a contract between the seller of an NFT and an auction house? How are auction houses, if you know, dealing with these NFTs and other digital assets?
I mean, it depends.
Yeah, I think I was just going to say, it depends which auction houses we're talking about. I mean, the two big ones are in it now, Sotheby's and Christie's, and those will be specialized contracts that they're working on that would represent both the seller, the buyer, and of course the auction house, somewhat under some of their standard terms. But I'm sure there are lots of disclaimers on the Sotheby's and the Christie's side. You can't say that let's say the marketplaces have a standardized contract. So I think some of it, depending on the size, the size of popularity of the artist might depend, but a lot of it is embedded in the terms and conditions of the marketplace. So I'll leave it to others to be more specific.
Well, just one note too, it's, Christie's and Sotheby's aren't the ones minting the NFTs. They're partnering with the marketplaces who are creating the NFTs. So I think that in general, what you can expect is that auction houses are going to consign NFTs much in the same way that they would consign any other work of art in terms of the warranties and disclaimers and everything that they require, and also in terms of the way that money is being exchanged. So, as far as I know at this point, they're not taking their fees in crypto, they're taking their fees in fiat. So although, I think it's pretty clear that most of the bidders so far on that, on the NFT art have been from the crypto world. So you do have this mixing, and I'm sure that that's something also that's going to evolve in terms of how those transactions happen, whether it's a matter of needing to have a wallet just to hold the asset, or whether you're actually bidding in crypto or dollars. So it depends is the unfortunate and lawyerly answer.
Yeah, I really second what Sarah and Donna are saying, and I think that's something that's really instructive here is what the UCC drafting committee, UCC Uniform Commercial Code, is really sort of, or at least the way in which they're approaching this. And for them, a controllable digital record is really dealt with as a standalone item. So the actual, if you want to term it, sort of the actual token that frames the NFT is seen as an independent item, which has its own rights and responsibilities, etc., and way in which it's dealt with as far as the UCC sees it. In other words, when they're doing the drafting and they're providing for these new digital records, they're saying that the underlying assets or rights which attach to those digital records are resolved by law other than the new Article 12 to the UCC that's being proposed. So when something is consigned into an auction house, it's really the investigation or the inquiry has to be what is really the underlying asset that's attached to this digital record that's being consigned. And that is an approach which involves applying existing principles. And I assume with the auction houses, something very similar to their existing consignment agreements, which they have, and arrangements, etc., that they would deal with real-world assets. But I think this involves an extended discussion also as to the concept of metadata. And how these digital assets are actually tied to the tokens. We're talking about ERC 721, which is a really sort of foundational standard which allows NFTs to come into life and which have been replicated on a number of other chains using equivalents or derivatives of that standard. For example, Binance Smart Chain is doing similar sort of non-fungible smart contracts. But the real essence is how do you actually, and what is the protocol for defining the metadata, which is the underlying asset, whether it's digital or physical, that attaches to that token. And there the protocols are not defined. ERC 721 doesn't include a metadata protocol. There's no standard protocol which is out there. There are groups now coming together to try and define those protocols. But if you think of you dealing with a music NFT, how do you actually attach the sound clip in a way which is responsible and which gives the rights that you want to give, particularly copyrights or other IP rights with regard to that sound clip. It's really an understanding of the interface between the actual token and the underlying asset that you're dealing with, which is the important part. I think really even more so than the actual functionality of a basic ERC 721 contract or an ERC 1155 contract. But they are amazing pieces of technology because they give us the ability to create these controllable digital records and to create an exchangeable means of technology which reflects ownership interests, which is a fundamental issue of this whole sort of exercise. But I think really applying real world concepts to the underlying asset really is the key issue as far as the auction houses are concerned.
I'd be interested, Nick, who reports on this area, I'd be interested in knowing from him, for many people, whether it's lawyers or artists or others, is this kind of their first foray into cryptosphere? Is this the first time, and maybe you don't know from your reporting, but is this the first time they're getting a wallet? I understand that both Christie's and Sotheby's made people get wallets. And if so, is this a good entry point? Is it positive? And what have been some of your reportings on seeing what this looks like?
Yeah, no, we actually have done some reporting around this, and it does look like for a lot of artists in particular, this is becoming an entry point into crypto. They set up a wallet and find a platform. OpenSea, Rarible, I think have been the two biggest ones, but there are dozens of others that are out there right now. But the flip side to that is what we found is so far, the artists that already have big followings are the ones who are best able to take advantage of this to actually monetize their work. A lot of artists who don't have a huge following, try to sell their NFTs on these platforms, but there's just no interest because either they're too unknown or for whatever other reason. So it's definitely acting as, I think, an entry point. Um, Although the hype has kind of, I don't think it's died quite yet, but there have been, there's been a small decline in, volume just, between February and March. I think we're going to get April's numbers pretty soon. So there has been, slight slackening of the interest in there. And so I guess, long term, I'm curious to see if that continues. But yeah, so far it does seem like this is an interesting entry point for a lot of people, just because it is easier to sell, an NFT right now than, perhaps to try and find the more traditional methods of selling your art online.
I think too, Nick, to your point, a lot of what's happening too in the progression of technology is that these marketplaces are figuring out ways to wrap in the wallet process to make it a lot more user friendly, so that that experience is frictionless and you don't have the challenges of setting up a wallet and purchasing the crypto and everything else. So I think eventually what we're going to see is a lot of those complicated entry challenges and hurdles are going to be hidden and made much more easy to access. Of course, that doesn't necessarily address some of the security concerns around wallets, but it definitely will make the experience easier for your average online shopper to participate.
Right. Yeah. I mean, if you can just sign up on MetaMask, that might be easier than setting up a whole, independent wallet. And I think some of the platforms are there right now. They just, like, they tie into your MetaMask wallet, but then again, to your point, that's when you have to be concerned about your security, because that is an online wallet.
Well, I think my understanding is Tezos with their marketplace is connecting with Kukai, so you don't even see it. You just, as soon as you're online, you can purchase with a credit card and it automatically sets up a wallet for you. So we'll see where that goes.
Yeah.
So we have one more question from the floor. It's from Andy Rosen. Copyright as it stands today for most creators is and has been a right without a remedy unless you were a big player. One of the problems I see is that trying to apply current copyright structure as it stands will be a mistake, fail, and hinder innovation. It's an analog situation trying to solve a huge growing digital problem. What are your thoughts on this?
I can see that. So again, this is one of those things where Congress isn't really looking at this, but a lot of, I think my understanding is, a lot of those concerns do stem from the DMCA and other laws passed, I guess, decades ago. So in order to get any change, any meaningful change there, someone would have to try and find, the congressperson to, and, encourage them to act on this. But I don't think it's a high priority right now. But I do remember, even before crypto, like this, copyright in the digital age has been an issue for, I think, a lot of creators, even back on YouTube in the late 2000s. You know, you had a lot of overreach from big companies, but smaller creators just had issues with maintaining their own copyright, or even getting dinged for copyright flags, even when they weren't in violation.
I also think that there's some, there's always some conversation around automatic licensing, or some way of figuring out a way to compensate the underlying creator for work that's been appropriated. But, and I think that in general, without even taking into account the NFT universe, I think that just looking at your contemporary art world and the way in which artists approach creation and appropriation and copyright in general, I think that there's a lot of room for conversation and rethinking copyright structures without even getting to the NFT world. And then once you add in this additional digital layer, of course, we're back to kind of that wild west of the internet, where when that first started, everyone assumed that as soon as you put something on the internet, it's available for everyone to use. So I like the idea of reconsidering all of copyright law and the entire structure. That's a fun conversation to have. I'm not sure where it's going to go, but I think it's definitely worth thinking about.
Well, it's 9:59 and we have barely touched the surface of these issues. I want to thank our panelists for their expertise and for their participation in today's discussion. I realize that there are unanswered questions both in the chat and Q&A. I think that's a function of the amount of time we have and also the huge number of issues that are raised by this discussion. So thank you very much to all of our panelists and to our audience. And this is a discussion that we will continue.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susan. Thanks, everybody.